The frozen ground crunched beneath boots as the small German patrol moved through the Ardennes forest. It was December 22nd, 1944, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes before a heavy snowfall. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crouched behind a shattered oak tree, his breath forming small clouds in the morning cold. His stomach had stopped growling days ago, replaced by a hollow ache that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. Beside him, his friend Werner pressed close to the frozen earth, scanning the tree line with eyes that had learned to see movement in shadow. They'd been on reduced rations for weeks. Breakfast that morning had been a slice of hard black bread no thicker than a finger, shared between 3 men. The coffee, if you could call it that, was mostly acorns and chicory, bitter enough to make your jaw ache. Klaus adjusted his grip on his carabiner rifle. The weapon felt heavier than it should, though he knew that was just weakness talking. Across the clearing, barely visible through the morning mist, lay an abandoned American position. Foxholes dug into the hillside, equipment scattered in the snow, and something else. Wooden crates. The kind that held supplies. Werner noticed them too. His voice was barely a whisper. "You think they left food?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans had pulled back during the night, part of the chaos that came with the German offensive pushing through the Belgian countryside. The Third Reich's propaganda had told them the Americans would crumble under the weight of the winter assault. So far, the Americans had mostly retreated in good order, leaving behind positions that looked more organized than abandoned. "Only one way to find out," Klaus finally replied. They waited another 10 minutes, watching for movement, for the glint of a rifle scope, for any sign this was a trap. But the forest remained silent, except for the occasional crack of distant artillery. Finally, Klaus gave the signal. The patrol moved forward, 5 men spreading out across the clearing, weapons ready, eyes sharp. The American foxholes were deeper than the ones Klaus was used to digging, lined with pine branches for insulation, wooden boards for flooring. One even had a small tarp stretched overhead. Werner shook his head in disbelief as he peered into one. They built hotels while we froze in the mud, but it was the crates that drew Klaus's attention. He knelt beside one, brushing away the light dusting of snow. The stenciled letters read, U.S. Army, Field Ration, C. His fingers, numb from cold, fumbled with the lid until it popped open with a crack that seemed too loud in the stillness. Inside were smaller boxes, dozens of them. Neatly packed, each one labelled in English he couldn't fully read. Klaus pulled one out, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, solid, real. He tore open the cardboard with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, with anticipation. What spilled into his palm made him stop breathing. A can. Meat and beans, the label said, with a picture that showed actual chunks of meat in rich brown sauce. Another can. Crackers. A small tin of cheese. A packet of instant coffee. Real coffee. Sugar tablets. Chewing gum. Cigarettes. Toilet paper. And at the bottom, wrapped in waxed paper, chocolate. Klaus stared at the contents spread across his lap. This was one meal. One single meal for one American soldier. Werner had opened his own box and was holding up a can of ham and eggs with an expression Klaus had never seen on his friend's face before. A mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like anger. "This is what their privates eat?" he said, his voice hollow. "They're common soldiers?" Around them, the other men in the patrol had found more crates, more boxes. The clearing filled with the sound of cardboard tearing, metal scraping, and stunned silence punctuated by disbelieving laughter. One soldier, Corporal Hans Dietrich, held up a can opener attached to the ration box by a small chain. "They even give them the tool to open it," he said quietly. "We have to share one opener between 10 men. Klaus pulled out the cigarettes. "Lucky strike," the package said. 4 of them. Perfectly rolled, dry, sealed in their own little packet. He'd been smoking whatever scraps of tobacco he could find, rolled in newspaper when paper was available. Sometimes they'd smoked leaves. These cigarettes looked like something from a magazine advertisement, the kind they'd seen in peacetime shops in Berlin. He lit one with trembling hands. The taste hit him like a memory of civilization. Smooth, rich, without the harshness of desperation tobacco. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he wasn't in a frozen forest eating food stolen from the enemy. He was somewhere warm, somewhere the war hadn't reached yet. Werner was reading the instructions printed on the inside of his ration box. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "It tells them how to heat the food. It gives them suggestions." Suggestions, Klaus. As if they have choices. Hans had managed to open his can of meat and beans. The smell that rose from it made every man in the clearing turn their heads. It was rich, savoury, impossibly appetizing. Steam curled into the cold air. He stared into the can for a long moment before speaking. "Our officers don't eat this well," he said flatly. "I've seen what the colonel gets for dinner. It's better than us, yes, but this is better than him." The words hung in the frozen air like an accusation. Klaus thought about their own rations, the thin soup they called Eintopf when they were lucky, the bread that could break teeth, the margarine that tasted like machine oil, the sausage that appeared maybe once a week if supply lines held. He thought about the hunger that had become as much a part of army life as roll call and marching. He thought about watching men grow thin, watching the flesh melt, from faces until skulls pressed against skin. And here, scattered across the snow, was enough food to feed their entire platoon for days. Food that the Americans had simply left behind because they couldn't carry it all. Werner sat down heavily in the snow, his ration box open across his knees. He pulled out the chocolate bar slowly, reverently. His hands were shaking. "Klaus," he said quietly, "how do we fight people who can afford to leave this behind?" He was too busy staring at his own chocolate bar. It was thick, dark, wrapped in waxed paper and sealed in foil. He broke off a piece and placed it on his tongue. The sweetness exploded across his senses, so intense it was almost painful. He hadn't tasted real chocolate in 2 years. The substitutes they'd been given, made from God knows what, were bitter chemical approximations of the real thing. This was what he remembered from childhood. This was what the world tasted like before the war. Hans was eating his meat and beans directly from the can, using the tiny folding spoon that had been included in the ration pack. Between mouthfuls he kept saying, mein Gott," as if the words were a prayer or a curse, maybe both. One of the younger soldiers, a boy named Friedrich who couldn't be more than 18, held up a packet of powdered lemonade mix. He looked at it with complete confusion. "What is this for?" he asked. "Why would a soldier need lemonade?" "Because they can have it," Werner answered bitterly. "Because their country can give it to them." Klaus opened his can of crackers. They were thick, crisp, salted. Nothing like the hard tack they'd been issued, the kind that required soaking in water or coffee just to make it chewable. These crackers crumbled perfectly in his mouth, releasing flavour, actual flavour. He spread some of the cheese on one. The cheese was soft, creamy, rich. It tasted expensive. It tasted like something from before the war, from a delicatessen in Hamburg where his father used to take him on Sundays. The can of ham and eggs that Werner finally opened released a smell that made Klaus's stomach clench with longing. Chunks of actual ham sat in scrambled eggs that still looked yellow, still looked like food instead of the grey mush they'd grown accustomed to. Werner ate slowly, savouring each bite, his eyes closed. When he opened them again, there were tears on his cheeks. He wiped them away quickly, angrily, as if ashamed. "We're losing," Werner said quietly. "We have to be losing. You don't leave food like this behind if you're struggling. You don't give your soldiers chocolate and cigarettes and lemonade if you're running out of anything." Klaus had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that frightened him. The propaganda back home talked about American weakness, about their soft civilian soldiers who couldn't match German discipline and fighting spirit. But these rations told a different story. These Rations spoke of an industrial capacity so vast, so overwhelming, that it could afford to give every single soldier food that rivaled what German officers ate, food that came with luxuries, with choices, with dignity. Hans pulled out the toilet paper from his ration pack and started laughing. It was a harsh, brittle sound. "They give them toilet paper," he said, holding up the small roll. "Individual rolls. We've been using leaves and snow for 6 months, and they get individual rolls of toilet paper." The laughter spread through the patrol, but it wasn't joyful. It was the laughter of men confronting an absurdity too large to process any other way. They sat in the snow, surrounded by abandoned American equipment, eating food that tasted like civilization, and laughed until the laughter died in their throats and left only silence. Klaus finished his chocolate and carefully folded the wrapper, tucking it into his pocket. He didn't know why he saved it, maybe as proof, maybe as a reminder, maybe because some part of him knew that years from now, when he tried to tell people about this moment, they wouldn't believe him. The winter sun climbed higher, burning through the morning mist. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of tanks, American tanks, most likely, preparing for a counterattack. The patrol had maybe an hour before they needed to withdraw back to their own lines. They spent that hour eating, trying different cans, sharing discoveries, marveling at packaging that seemed designed to keep food fresh, to make it appealing, to remind soldiers that somewhere back home someone cared whether they ate well. Friedrich found a pack of chewing gum and stared at it as if it were alien technology. 5 sticks, perfectly wrapped. He put one in his mouth and his eyes went wide. "It's mint," he said with wonder. "Fresh mint. Like toothpaste but sweet." Werner had moved on to a can of fruit cocktail, peaches, pears, grapes, cherries, all swimming in sweet syrup. He ate it, slowly, making it last. And when he was done, he drank the syrup from the can. The sugar hit his system like a drug. He felt his hands stop shaking, felt warmth spread through his body, felt something that might have been energy, or might have been hope. Klaus opened his last can. Pork and beans. The pork was real. Visible chunks of meat floating in a rich sauce studded with beans that were whole and tender. He heated it over a small fire one of the men had started, using the little folding stove that had been included in one of the ration kits. The Americans even gave their soldiers portable stoves, individual heating units. The excess was staggering. As they ate, Hans kept looking at the pile of unopened ration boxes. There were dozens left, too many to carry. They'd take what they could, but most of it would stay here, waiting for the Americans to return or for the snow to bury it. The waste of it, the sheer abundance that allowed for waste, was almost offensive in its implications. "We should tell the others," Friedrich said suddenly, "back at our lines. They need to know what the Americans have." Werner shook his head slowly. "They won't believe us. I wouldn't believe us if I hadn't seen it myself." Klaus thought about their company commander, a stern Prussian officer who still believed in final victory, who still insisted that German superior will would triumph over American material. How would he react to the news that American privates ate better than he did? That the enemy had so much they could afford to abandon it in the snow? The chocolate sits heavy in Klaus's stomach, a sweet weight he hasn't felt in years. He looks down at his hands, still holding the empty can of pork and beans. His fingers are sticky with sauce. He licks them clean, savouring every last trace of flavour, aware that this might be the best meal he eats for months, maybe ever again. When it's time to leave, each man packs his field bag with as many ration boxes as he can carry. They leave, behind nearly 3/4 of what they found. It hurts to abandon food, but they can't carry it all and still move quickly enough to avoid being caught. As they prepare to withdraw, Klaus takes one last look at the American position. The foxholes, with their wooden floors and insulated walls, the scattered equipment, all of it in good condition, all of it evidence of an army that had too much rather than too little. The crates of rations sitting in the snow, more food than his entire company had seen in a month. "We're not fighting soldiers," Werner says quietly beside him. "We're fighting a factory. and the factory is winning. They moved back through the forest in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, each man carrying the weight of revelation, along with the precious rations in their packs. The trees closed around them, shadows deepening as clouds rolled in from the west. Behind them, the American position disappeared into the grey distance, but the taste of chocolate and real coffee remained. Back at their own lines, the contrast was immediate and brutal. German positions were cramped, hastily dug, offering minimal protection from the elements. Men huddled around fires that gave more smoke than heat, trying to warm their hands enough to maintain feeling in their fingers. The smell of the camp was one Klaus had grown accustomed to: unwashed bodies, damp wool, the chemical tang of cordite, and the thin, watery aroma of whatever passed for soup in the field kitchen. Klaus and his patrol were met by their platoon leader, Lieutenant Steiner, a career officer whose family had served in the German military for 3 generations. His face was drawn, weathered by more than just the December cold. Lines of exhaustion and responsibility had carved themselves deep around his eyes and mouth. "Report," he said simply, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Klaus hesitated, unsure how to explain what they'd found. "We secured the American position, sir." They withdrew. "During the night, we recovered supplies." Steiner's eyes flickered with interest. "Ammunition?" "Food, sir." "American field rations?" The lieutenant's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "Show me." Klaus unslung his pack and removed one of the C-Ration boxes. He handed it to Steiner, who took it with the careful attention of a man examining evidence. The officer turned the box over, studying the labelling, the construction, the weight of it. Then he opened it. What followed was a silence that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did. Steiner removed each item from the box, laying them out on a flat rock like artifacts from another world. The canned meat, the crackers, the cheese, the chocolate, the cigarettes, the coffee, the accessories, the matches, the can opener, the small packet of toilet paper. When he was done, he stood looking at the array of supplies with an expression Klaus couldn't quite read. Finally, Steiner spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "How many of these did they leave behind?" "Dozens, sir. We couldn't carry them all." Steiner picked up the chocolate bar, turned it over in his gloved hands. He unwrapped it slowly and broke off a small piece. He placed it in his mouth and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Klaus. "Do you understand what this means?" Klaus wasn't sure what answer was expected, so he remained silent. "This isn't just food," Steiner continued, his voice low. "This is a statement. This is America telling us that they have so much, they can give each individual soldier luxuries we can't provide our officers." He paused, weighing the chocolate bar in his hand. "We're fighting an economy, not just an army." The lieutenant's words confirmed what Klaus had been thinking but hadn't dared voice. Around them, other soldiers had noticed the confiscated rations. Word was spreading through the company like fire through dry grass. Men appeared from foxholes and shelters, drawn by rumours of American food, of chocolate and real coffee. Steiner made a decision. He called the company together, about 80 men, hollow-faced and hungry, their uniforms patched and threadbare. He held up the C-Ration box like a preacher holding scripture. "This is what we're facing," he told them. His voice carried across the assembled soldiers, steady and clear. "This is what the Americans give their common soldiers, not their officers, not their elite units. Every private, every man in their army, eats like this." He opened the can of meat and beans, still cold but aromatic enough that Klaus could see men in the front row swallow reflexively. Their propaganda tells us the Americans are soft, that they lack discipline and fighting spirit. But a nation that can afford to feed its soldiers like this, that can give them chocolate and cigarettes and coffee, that nation has resources we can't match. Some of the older soldiers nodded slowly, understanding dawning in their eyes. But Klaus noticed the younger ones, boys like Friedrich, who'd been fed years of Nazi ideology, looking confused, almost betrayed. One of them, a private named Otto, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, if they have so much, why are we still fighting them?" Steiner's expression softened slightly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Because we're soldiers, Otto, we follow orders. But we also face reality. And the reality is standing right here in my hands. That night, Steiner distributed what rations they'd recovered among the men. Each soldier got a small taste, a piece of chocolate, a few crackers, a cigarette. It wasn't enough to satisfy hunger, but it was enough to plant questions that wouldn't easily be uprooted. Klaus sat in his foxhole, sharing space with Werner and Friedrich. They'd been given half a can of meat and beans to split between the three of them. They ate it slowly, savouring each spoonful, trying to make it last. Friedrich, who'd never known anything but wartime rationing and Nazi promises of victory, kept shaking his head. "My brother writes from the Eastern Front," he said quietly. "He says they're eating their horses, sometimes worse." "And the Americans have this?" Werner lit one of the Lucky Strike cigarettes, taking a long drag. The cherry glowed bright in the darkness of the foxhole. "I worked in a factory before the war," he said. "In Stuttgart. We made machine parts. I understand production, capacity, logistics." He tapped ash into the snow. "To supply an army like this, across an ocean, while also fighting in the Pacific, while also keeping their population fed at home? The numbers don't lie, Klaus. We can't win this." Klaus wanted to argue, wanted to defend something, pride or country or the propaganda that had shaped his understanding of the war. But the taste of real coffee still lingered on his tongue, and the full feeling in his stomach, even from half a can of beans, was a luxury he'd almost forgotten existed. The evidence was undeniable. In the foxholes around them, similar conversations were taking place. Klaus could hear fragments carried on the cold night air, whispered discussions about abundance and scarcity, about what it meant that the enemy could be so careless with food. The C-Rations had done more to demoralize the company than any Allied bombardment could have achieved. Lieutenant Steiner sat apart from his men in the shelter that served as his command post. He'd saved one complete C-ration for himself, and now he examined each component with the attention of a scholar studying ancient texts. He opened the instant coffee packet and smelled it. Real Arabica beans, ground fine and processed for easy brewing. He read the instructions printed on the ration box, instructions that assumed the soldier receiving it could read, had access to hot water, had time to prepare a proper meal. His orderly, a corporal named Braun, who'd served with him since Poland, watched with curiosity. "Sir, if I may ask, what will you report to battalion about the American supplies?" Steiner continued, examining the ration. "I will report exactly what we found." He looked up at Braun. "I will tell them the truth, that we captured enemy rations far superior to anything we provide our own men, that these rations suggest an industrial and logistical capacity we cannot hope to match. And how do you think battalion will respond, sir?" Steiner smiled grimly. "They'll tell me to focus on fighting spirit and German superiority. They'll dismiss it as propaganda or exaggeration." He set down the ration box. "But you and I both know what we're seeing here, Braun. We're seeing the future, and we're on the wrong side of it." The next morning brought new orders. The company was to continue the offensive, pushing deeper into the Ardennes, trying to maintain the momentum of what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. But something had changed in the men. They moved with the same discipline, followed the same orders, but the certainty was gone. Klaus noticed it in the way soldiers looked at each other, in the conversations that stopped when officers approached, in the careful rationing of the captured American food that some men hoarded like treasure. Friedrich carried his piece of chocolate for 3 days before finally eating it, savouring it in tiny bites that he made last an entire evening. Werner wrote a letter to his wife that night, though mail service had become irregular at best. He told her about the American rations, described the chocolate and real coffee in detail that bordered on obsession. He wrote, "I no longer believe what they tell us about the enemy being weak or desperate. A desperate nation does not feed its soldiers like kings. A weak nation does not have surplus to abandon in the snow. The letter would never be sent. It would sit in Werner's pocket through the remaining weeks of the Ardennes offensive, growing more creased and worn until it became illegible. But the act of writing it mattered. It was an acknowledgement of truth, a rejection of the lies. They'd been fed along with their meagre rations. As December gave way to January, the German offensive stalled and then collapsed. The Americans counterattacked with overwhelming force, supported by air power that filled the sky once the weather cleared. Klaus's company was pushed back, fighting retreat after retreat, losing men to combat and frostbite, and the simple exhaustion of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Through it all, Klaus carried one item from that American ration box, not food that had been eaten quickly, not cigarettes, those had been smoked or traded. He carried the empty chocolate wrapper, folded carefully and kept in his breast pocket, close to his heart. It was a talisman of sorts, a reminder that the world could be different than what he'd known. One frozen morning in mid-January, the company found itself surrounded. American armor had cut off their retreat, and artillery was walking closer with each salvo. Lieutenant Steiner gathered his remaining men, maybe 40 soldiers out of the 80 who'd started the offensive. His face was grey with fatigue and frostbite, but his voice remained steady. "We're cut off," he told them simply. "Our orders are to fight to the last man." He paused, looking at each face, these boys and veterans who'd followed him through hell. "But I'm giving you a choice. We can attempt to break out, knowing most of us won't make it, or we can surrender." The word hung in the cold air like a grenade waiting to explode. Surrender had always been presented as the ultimate shame, a betrayal of everything they'd been taught to believe. But Klaus thought about the chocolate wrapper in his pocket, about an enemy that treated food with casual abundance, and he wondered if surrender might mean survival. It was Werner who spoke first. "Sir, if we surrender, what happens to us?" "If their rations are any indication," he said quietly, "we'll be treated better than we're treating ourselves." The decision was made by consensus rather than command. They would surrender. They destroyed their weapons as protocol demanded, smashed the firing pins on rifles, disabled the machine guns, rendered useless everything that could be used against them. Then they waited, hands raised, as American tanks rolled into view. The Americans who accepted their surrender were professionals, neither cruel nor particularly kind. They searched the prisoners efficiently, confiscated anything of military value, and organized them into columns for transport to the rear. Klaus noticed the American soldiers looked well fed, their uniforms in good condition despite weeks of winter combat. They moved with the confidence of men who knew their supply lines were secure. As they marched toward captivity, Klaus found himself walking beside an American sergeant who was supervising the column. The soldier offered him a cigarette, a Lucky Strike, the same brand, that had been in the C-Ration. Klaus took it with trembling hands, not from cold, but from the strangeness of the gesture. "Thank you," he said in broken English. The American shrugged. "War's over for you guys. Might as well have a smoke." They walked in silence for a while. Then Klaus worked up the courage to ask the question that had haunted him since that morning in the forest. "Your rations," he said carefully. "The food in boxes. All soldiers get this?" The sergeant looked at him curiously. "The sea rats?" "Yeah, everyone gets them." "Why?" Klaus didn't know how to explain that those rations had shattered his understanding of the war, that chocolate and real coffee had done more damage to his morale than any weapon. Instead, he simply said, "In Germany, we don't have this. Not soldiers, not anyone." The sergeant's expression shifted, something like comprehension crossing his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess that's the difference, isn't it? We fight for a country that can still take care of people. Makes it easier to believe in what you're doing." The prisoner of war camp was in Belgium, hastily constructed but functional. True to the pattern established by the rations, the Americans fed their prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. The meals weren't as elaborate as the C-Rations had been, but they were regular, sufficient, and far better than anything Klaus had eaten in the German army for the past year. That first night in captivity, lying on a cot in a heated barracks, Klaus pulled out the chocolate wrapper. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases. The foil caught the lamplight, reflecting in small golden fragments. Werner, in the bunk beside him, noticed. "You kept it." Klaus nodded. "I don't know why. Maybe to remember. Maybe to have proof." "Proof of what?" Klaus thought about how to answer. "Proof that we were wrong," he finally said. "About everything. About who was strong and who was weak. About who could win and who couldn't. This wrapper, this piece of trash from one American meal, it told the truth when everything else was lies. Around them, other prisoners were settling in. Some were sleeping already, exhausted by combat and surrender. Others talked quietly, processing the end of their war. Near the stove, a group was discussing the food they'd been served for dinner. Simple American army rations, but to men who'd been starving, it might as well have been a feast. Friedrich, the youngest of their group, sat at a table writing a letter. Klaus walked over and sat across from him. "Writing home?" Friedrich nodded, trying to explain what happened. "Why we surrendered." He set down his pen and looked at Klaus. "Do you think they'll understand? My family? That it wasn't cowardice? It was just reality?" Klaus thought about the chocolate wrapper in his pocket, about the vast industrial might it represented, about the simple mathematics of a war fought against an enemy who could afford to give every soldier luxuries while you struggled to give your men basic sustenance. "Tell them about the rations," he said. "Tell them what the Americans eat. They'll understand." In the following days and weeks, as more German prisoners arrived at the camp, the story of the C-Rations spread. It became something of a legend among the captives, this tale of soldiers who'd captured American supplies and found not military intelligence or weapons, but chocolate and coffee and cheese. It was told and retold, each telling adding new details, but the core remained the same. A revelation about abundance, about the true nature of the war they'd been fighting. Lieutenant Steiner, housed in the officers' section of the camp, was interrogated by American intelligence. They asked him about German positions, strength, morale. He answered truthfully, knowing the war was lost and seeing no purpose in protecting secrets that no longer mattered. But when they asked what had affected his unit's morale most significantly, he surprised them. "Your C-Rations," he said. The American intelligence officer looked confused. "I'm sorry, what?" Steiner explained about the captured supplies, about the effect they'd had on his men. "We'd been told you were a soft nation," he said, "that your soldiers lacked discipline and fighting spirit, that you were on the verge of industrial collapse. Then my men found your field rations and realized everything we'd been told was a lie. You don't give soldiers chocolate and cigarettes and real coffee unless you have more than you need. And a nation with more than it needs can't be losing." The intelligence officer wrote this down with interest. "So you're saying our logistics affected your tactical decisions?" Steiner smiled faintly. "I'm saying your chocolate was better propaganda than anything your leaflets could have achieved." The interview was included in reports that made their way up through American intelligence channels. Some analyst somewhere filed it away. A curious footnote about the psychological impact of abundant supplies. But for the men who'd lived it, for Klaus and Werner and Friedrich and the others who'd tasted that brief moment of American plenty, it was more than a footnote. It was the moment the war's outcome became undeniable. Spring came to the camp, bringing warmth and news of German surrender. Klaus and his comrades listened to the announcement with mixed feelings. Relief that the killing was over, grief for what had been lost, uncertainty about what came next. But underneath it all, for Klaus at least, was a strange kind of validation. The chocolate hadn't lied. The coffee had told the truth. The nation that could afford such abundance had won, just as simple mathematics had always suggested it would. Years later, after repatriation, after rebuilding, after Germany had been transformed from enemy to ally, Klaus would tell his children about the war. He'd talk about the fear and cold, about friends lost and battles fought. But the story he told most often the one that seemed to capture something essential about the experience, was about the morning his patrol found American C-Rations in the snow. He'd describe opening that first box, the disbelief at seeing chocolate and real coffee, the moment when propaganda collided with reality and reality won. He'd pull out the chocolate wrapper, still creased and worn, still carrying the faint scent of cocoa after all those years. This, he'd tell them, this piece of foil taught me more about power and nations and truth than all the speeches I ever heard. His son, too young to remember the war but old enough to be curious, once asked him if he hated the Americans for defeating Germany. Klaus thought about the question carefully before answering. He thought about cold and hunger, about lies and propaganda, about the chocolate wrapper in his pocket and what it represented. "No," he finally said, "I can't hate people who showed me that the world could be different, who proved that abundance was possible, that nations could choose to take care of their people instead of sacrificing them. We fought for the wrong things, and we lost. But in losing, we learned. That chocolate bar taught me that defeat isn't always the worst outcome. Sometimes defeat is just the truth arriving late." The chocolate wrapper stayed with Klaus for the rest of his life. When he died, an old man in a reunified Germany that bore little resemblance to the one he'd fought for, they found it among his possessions. His children almost threw it away, this piece of trash that their father had kept for decades. But his grandson, a student of history, recognized it for what it was. Not just a wrapper, but a witness. A tiny piece of foil that had traveled through time carrying a message about the nature of power and the price of lies. Today, that wrapper sits in a small museum in Hamburg, displayed under glass with a card explaining its significance. Thousands of people pass by it each year, most barely glancing at what appears to be an Allsolar, ordinary piece of packaging. But those who stop to read the story learn about Klaus Zimmermann and his patrol, about the morning they captured American C-Rations and realized the war was lost. They learn that sometimes victory isn't decided by courage or tactics or fighting spirit. Sometimes it's decided by something as simple as who can afford to give their soldiers chocolate. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but the quiet demonstration of abundance in the face of scarcity. The story of those C-Rations spread beyond Klaus and his company. Throughout the final months of the war, as German positions collapsed and surrender became common, similar tales emerged. Units capturing American supplies and finding not just weapons and ammunition, but food that spoke of impossible plenty. Soldiers trading information about what they'd found, passing around cigarettes and chocolate like evidence in a trial where the verdict was already known. In prisoner of war camps across Europe, German soldiers compared notes about American rations. The C-Rations became a symbol, a shorthand for understanding the true balance of power. When new prisoners arrived and still clung to delusions about German superiority or eventual victory, the veterans would tell them about the rations. They'd describe the chocolate, the coffee, the casual abundance, and watch as understanding dawned in young eyes. Werner, who survived the war and returned to his factory work in Stuttgart, became a labor organizer in the new West Germany. He often spoke to workers about dignity and fair treatment, about what a society owed to its people. And when he wanted to illustrate the importance of providing for human needs, he'd tell the story of the C-Rations. "A nation that feeds its soldiers well," he'd say, "is a nation that respects human dignity. We fought for people who saw us as expendable. The Americans fought for people who thought they deserved chocolate." Friedrich, youngest of the patrol, became a teacher. He taught history to generations of German students, and he made sure they understood that wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in factories and farms, in the logistics of supply chains and the mathematics of production. And sometimes, he'd tell his classes, you can see the future in small things. In a can of meat and beans, in a bar of chocolate, in the care a nation shows to its ordinary people. The lesson the C-Rations taught wasn't just about military might or industrial capacity. It was about values, about what a nation chooses to do with its resources. The United States in 1944 was fighting a global war on two fronts, yet it chose to give its soldiers not just sustenance but small dignities. Coffee that tasted good, chocolate to lift spirits, cigarettes to calm nerves, even toilet paper, that most mundane of necessities. These choices revealed a philosophy, a belief that soldiers were citizens in uniform who deserved to be treated with respect. Meanwhile, the Third Reich, despite its propaganda about the master race and German superiority, treated its own soldiers as expendable resources to be used until they broke. Klaus understood this eventually, though it took years of reflection. The C-Rations had been his first glimpse of a different way of organizing society, one where abundance wasn't hoarded by elites but distributed to ordinary people doing difficult work. It was a small example, almost trivial in the context of a massive war, but it pointed towards something larger, a different understanding of what government owed to its people. In the prisoner of war camp, Klaus had time to think about these things. The Americans provided books, including some in German, and he read about democracy and capitalism and the American experiment. He learned about a nation built on the idea that ordinary people deserved opportunity and dignity, and he began to understand why that nation could afford to give its soldiers chocolate. It wasn't just about having more resources, though America certainly had those. It was about a system that, for all its flaws, channeled those resources toward improving ordinary lives rather than enriching a small elite. It was about unions that fought for workers' rights, about businesses that competed to serve consumers, about a government that, however imperfectly, answered to its citizens. The contrast with Nazi Germany couldn't have been starker. The Reich had promised glory and delivered suffering. It had demanded sacrifice while its leaders lived in luxury. It had proclaimed superiority while its soldiers starved. The C-Rations were physical proof of that failure, evidence wrapped in waxed paper and sealed in tin. As Klaus learned English in the camp, practicing with American guards who were often friendly and curious, he asked questions about life in America. What he learned fascinated him. Workers who owned cars, families who ate meat regularly, children who expected to attend school. It was a world so different from what he'd known that it seemed almost fictional. One guard, a farmer's son from Iowa, described his life before the war. 3 meals a day, he said matter-of-factly, meat at most meals. My mother baked fresh bread twice a week. We had a radio, electricity, running water. He paused, seeing Klaus's expression. That's just normal, you know? That's how most folks live back home. Klaus did the math in his head. If most Americans lived like that, the industrial and agricultural capacity required was staggering. No wonder they could afford C-Rations. They were fighting a war while maintaining a standard of living that most Germans couldn't imagine even in peacetime. The realization was both humbling and infuriating. Humbling because it revealed how thoroughly they'd been deceived about America's weakness. Infuriating because it showed how unnecessary their suffering had been. Germany could have chosen differently. It could have built a society focused on raising living standards rather than conquering neighbours. But it had made other choices, and those choices had led inevitably to this cold and hunger and defeat. When repatriation finally came in 1946, Klaus returned to a Hamburg that barely resembled the city he'd left. Allied bombing had reduced much of it to rubble. His family's apartment building was gone, replaced by a crater filled with debris. His parents had survived but were living in a cellar, struggling with the same food shortages that had plagued the army. Klaus shared his C-Ration story with his father, trying to explain why he'd surrendered, why he'd stopped believing in victory. His father, a veteran of the First World War, understood immediately. Logistics, he said simply. The First War was the same. We fought bravely, but we couldn't match their production. Some lessons have to be relearned, it seems. But Klaus's mother had a different reaction. She held the chocolate wrapper carefully, examining it like a holy relic. You kept this all through the war? She asked. Klaus nodded. It reminded me that the truth existed, even when everything around me was lies. She folded it carefully and handed it back. Then you keep it still, she said. Germany will need people who remember the truth, who learned to recognize lies. who understand that strength isn't about what you can take from others, but what you can provide for your own people. Those words stayed with Klaus. As Germany rebuilt, as the Marshall Plan brought American aid and expertise, as the new West Germany emerged from the ashes of the Third Reich, he thought often about what his mother had said. The lesson of the C-Rations wasn't just about military defeat, it was about the kind of society worth building. He became active in rebuilding efforts, working with American advisors who helped restructure German industry. He advocated for worker protections and fair wages, arguing that a strong Germany meant well-fed Germans, not just profitable factories. He fought against those who wanted to rebuild the old hierarchies, reminding people where those hierarchies had led. And sometimes, when he needed to make a point about the importance of caring for ordinary people, he'd pull out the chocolate wrapper. This, he'd say, this is what a nation looks like when it values its citizens. The Americans gave this to every soldier, not as a reward, but as a basic right. They won the war because they understood that people who are well treated fight harder, work smarter, and build better societies. The chocolate wrapper became something of a symbol in Klaus's circle. Other veterans would share their own stories of captured American supplies, creating a collective memory of the moment they realized the war was lost. These stories served a purpose in the new Germany. They helped people understand that defeat hadn't been about cowardice or betrayal, but about fundamental imbalances in how societies were organized. Werner visited Klaus in Hamburg in 1952. They hadn't seen each other since repatriation, and both men had changed. Werner had become a union leader. Klaus was working in city administration, helping coordinate reconstruction. They met at a cafe that had recently reopened, one of the first signs that Hamburg was recovering. "Do you still have it?" Werner asked. "The wrapper?" Klaus pulled it from his wallet, more creased now, but still recognizable. "Every day," he said. "It reminds me of what we're building toward." Werner smiled. "I tell the story to workers all the time. I tell them that America won because they treated ordinary people with dignity. That if we want to build a strong Germany, we need to do the same. Some of the old guard doesn't like it. But the young people get it." They talked for hours, comparing notes on the new Germany, on the changes they were seeing, on the stubborn resistance from those who clung to the old ways. But they both felt hopeful. The Germany being built in the 1950s wasn't perfect, but it was learning the right lessons. It was becoming a place where ordinary people could expect decent treatment, where workers had rights, where the government saw its role as serving citizens rather than commanding them. The American chocolate bar had taught them that such things were possible. It had shown them a glimpse of a different way, and now they were working to build that way at home. Friedrich joined them later that afternoon, still passionate about education, still convinced that teaching the truth about the war was essential to preventing it from happening again. He'd brought some of his students, young Germans born during or just after the war, who wanted to hear first-hand accounts. "Tell them about the C-Rations," Werner said. So Klaus did. He pulled out the wrapper and told the story again. The patrol in the Ardennes, the captured American position, the boxes of rations that contained not just food but a revelation. He watched the students' faces as they processed the implications, seeing understanding dawn in young eyes just as it had dawned in his own that cold December morning. One student asked a question that had troubled Klaus for years. "Didn't you feel angry that the Americans had so much while you had so little?" Klaus considered his answer carefully. "At first, yes. It felt unfair, but then I realized the unfairness wasn't that they had abundance. It was that we'd been denied it by our own leaders. The Americans didn't make us hungry. Our government did that by choosing war over welfare, by spending everything on weapons instead of taking care of its people." Another student spoke up. "My grandfather says we lost because we were betrayed, because people at home didn't support the war enough." Klaus shook his head firmly. "We lost because we were fighting an enemy that could afford to give every soldier chocolate. That's not betrayal. That's mathematics. And it's a lesson we need to remember, not because it justifies our defeat, but because it teaches us what makes a nation truly strong. The students left eventually, carrying with them new perspectives on the war and what it meant. Klaus, Werner, and Friedrich sat in the cafe as evening approached, 3 old soldiers who'd found meaning in defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.